Hello everyone, welcome to Tea with TPS. Today we have a most celebrated civil servant of India, Sri K.M. Chandrasekhar. He has occupied very many important positions in the government of Kerala as well as in the government of India, the most prominent being the Cabinet Secretary of the government of India. And also he had two diplomatic assignments, one in Brussels and the other as ambassador to the WTO in Geneva. So he has such a high reputation in the service that he is considered a doyen of the IAS bureaucracy in India today. We are so delighted to have him here with us, and we have a long list of questions to ask him because he is a person with wide interests and keen observation and very wise assessments. So we are very pleased to have him on our show today. Welcome, Sri Chandrasekhar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador Srinivasan. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Fortunate that we are separated by so many kilometers.
Well, I think it's an advantage because when we meet each other, we don't have enough time. But now everybody is stuck at home, and I think it's easier to communicate. So let's take it as one of the advantages.
That's true.
Well, first let me ask you a personal question. If you don't want to answer it, don't. There is a legend in the Foreign Service that when you were appointed as ambassador to WTO, there was some competition from the Foreign Service.
Yes.
But eventually, the Prime Minister decided in your favor because the Commerce Minister threatened to resign if you were not sent to Geneva. Is there any?
Well, I can tell. Yeah, you want me to talk about that particular incident?
Yes.
Well, actually, it did happen. There was a mistake made by the by the External Affairs Ministry.
Yeah.
They sent the file directly to the president, along with other ambassadorial appointments, without routing it. In this particular case, this post is allocated, or the Commerce Ministry has been occupying this position. So it went without his knowing. This, at that time, Murasoli Maran was the minister, and he got very irritated with that. I mean, this whole conflict had been going on for some time. Perhaps the other gentleman might have got it also, had the file been routed through the Commerce Minister. But as it is, it was not done.
Well, basically because people think that the ministry rated you so high and the minister was willing to take your case up. So that is how it is.
Yeah.
But now I know that you're also engaged in various other activities, like you are on the board of several organizations, companies, NGOs, and also, giving advice to various non-governmental organizations. So you have a busy time to write articles. I know you are working on a book. So you have a very busy time, and I'm so glad that you were able to come to us today.
Frankly, my day is, I work for half a day. The remaining part, I either see a movie with my wife, or I relax, or I read a book. Half a day, yes. That's okay.
Well, I seem to spend more than half a day on various Well, I have a number of things, but let us start with COVID-19. Every discussion starts with COVID-19 these days. Kerala is probably the only state where the chief minister goes to the press every day and briefs on the situation, the COVID situation in Kerala. But people suspect that this is a political move rather than anything else. And also, as a result, various other issues which come up will also go into this. So it has become some kind of a show of the chief minister's position. So initially, Kerala was supposed to have completely mastered the situation, but now the situation doesn't seem so comfortable. But what exactly is the impact on Kerala of COVID so far?
Well, I think COVID generally has had an impact on the whole country. It's not just limited to Kerala.
No, I know that.
And
No, I said I know that, but we wanted to focus on that.
Focus on Kerala, the particular situation now. You see, what I'm saying is COVID has come, which means that there will be a considerable amount of cessation of economic activity, which will be applied to Kerala and it will apply to other states also. Now, economic activity in Kerala is particularly constrained because in the Gulf countries also prices of oil have been falling, with the result that a large number of people in the years to come. And so far as the disease is concerned, well, I think we have a better equipped health system than other states in India. I mean, ever since, from 1956 onwards, we have given a lot of attention to health and to education, with the result that you have higher literacy.
The Kerala model.
You have the Kerala model, which worked in the beginning. Right now, it's got affected because people came in, and perhaps some more effort should have been made to quarantine many of the people who came in institutionally, rather than allow them to go home so that they don't spread it all around. Maybe that was a mistake that was made, which has resulted in community transmission.
Yes,
it will take time
arrival of Kerala from abroad was the one which triggered the latest problem, didn't it?
It is not only the arrival of Keralites from abroad, it is also the arrival of Keralites from other states.
Other parts of India.
Other parts of India. That also has, because I think more emphasis would have been given to controlling entry points in the airports and so on. But it would be more difficult in the border areas.
The positive element is that we have not been overwhelmed in terms of facilities, hospital rooms.
No, not yet. Not yet. I hope it.
That fear is there, but at the same time, we have not reached that stage. And
that fear is there. That fear is there, but we do believe that I think there is greater awareness now of how to treat COVID. So, with the result that even home care could be, not that difficult. In the earlier stages, it was rather difficult because nobody knows. Even now, actually, people really do not know what is COVID, what will be the impact of COVID.
And what long-term effects on the individual.
I can't hear you. They don't know, because I just read to you before we started this discussion. They are saying that in Wuhan, about 90% of the people who have recovered from COVID, their lungs are damaged. So what will be the long-term effect? Then another thing that is being stated is that even if you have a vaccine or if you develop antibodies, these antibodies survive only for a couple of months. So you can get another attack. So I think particularly for people who have weak lungs and of course other comorbidities, it's a difficult disease, but the mortality is not high. No, when you talk about Kerala's health system, I think one great thing which we have not really recognized is the way in which the Nipah virus was handled. Sorry. The way in which Nipah virus was handled. You see, it started similar to the Wuhan virus, but we managed to contain it to just 2 districts. Only Malappuram and Kozhikode had some cases. If Nipah virus had also spread, there was man-to-man, human-to-human transmission. If that had spread, the effect would have been much greater because mortality rate
was higher. Mortality was
much higher. So that, I think, is a great success story, which I mean, I think this was more difficult. I mean, containing COVID is more difficult because it comes from all over. It comes from various parts of the country. It had started in different places. It's still people are coming in. We don't know how to deal with the disease. So it's more difficult. But I think that Nipah was a wonderful achievement.
Talking about the economic situation, we are not a manufacturing state. We do not have many industries. Of course, IT we have now, that's a major component. But otherwise, do you think Kerala's economic crisis would not be as acute as in the industrial states like Maharashtra, etc.? Is it so? Because once the market is open, we will be back in the same position. Agricultural production may not be affected that much. And therefore, are we more comfortable because of the fact that we are a consuming state rather than an industrial state?
You see, we are a consuming state, I agree. But the fact is that our capacity to consume will go down considerably because of the oil crisis of the Gulf countries. And the fact that incomes have fallen. Generally, many companies, there is unemployment, salaries have been brought down. That will result in lower incomes and less purchasing power. Now, if you have less purchasing power, it's going to affect your tax collecting capability altogether. I mean, Kerala, as you recall, has always been in favor of goods and services tax because it is a consuming state. We will get more revenue because it is a consuming state. We will be collecting it here instead of origin states. The whole conflict arose in respect of GST because certain origin states were objecting to destination states becoming the collecting points for GST. We wanted that, but that capacity is going to come down, which is going to affect government financing also. It is going to affect infrastructure projects. It is going to affect the capacity to spend. So it's certainly going to affect Kenya. That's my feeling.
But also,
and money is not going to come in, you know.
Yes.
That is the problem.
Now, looking at the past, there is no abject poverty in Kerala. There is no starvation. And that advantage also we have because we have enough.
That is very true. That is very true.
And that advantage also we have. We may be able to produce enough in order to feed our people. Well,
no, I agree with
this is the position relating to our trade with China, which you are a trade expert also. The measures that we have taken, that's not a trade war yet. But how is it going to affect us? Because there are so much of Chinese goods in the market everywhere. Because they're all plastic goods and things like that. The others we don't see. The Chinese things are mostly inside the machines that we use, and also in the industry, even nuclear and even space, etc., etc. But in terms of boycott of China or in terms of a trade restriction on China, is it going to affect us?
Well, overall, again, I can only talk from an India point of view, not just a Kerala point of view. The thing is, as you mentioned, many industrial raw materials, as well as many products of use in industry, they're coming from China. For example, you take solar panels. Now, 90% of solar panels in the world are produced in China. We can't really, I mean, we are depending on renewable energy to bring our prices down, our tariffs down. So it's not easy to give up China altogether. Again, the Indian
pharmaceuticals also, no?
Pharmaceuticals, Indian pharma industry, they have started using ingredients from China at a lower cost. This has become particularly necessary because with the TRIPS agreement in the WTO coming into effect, the price of molecules has gone up considerably. So once you can get many of these molecules from China, your prices will be low. So this is going to affect us from the inflation point of view. Consumer goods, like diyas and this little plastic goods and all, we can do without it. The local industry will develop. But the basic goods, I think that will be difficult. I think it will be very, I'm sure that government of India will also take a sensible decision on that.
No, so if the border situation continues to be tense and the Chinese do not disengage, what options do we have? Of course, one option is to talk. The second option is to strengthen our defense. But the third option of commercial action, how much can we carry it forward?
I don't think we can carry it forward much, quite frankly, because we are not in the same league as China. China produces much more. Their GDP is 5 times that of India. Our share in the Chinese, in the Chinese trade, our share is much lower. I mean, we cannot really do too much of harm to China. But if they decide to retaliate on the economic front, which they have not till now, it can be serious for India also.
That be about $75 billion or something.
Absolutely, it's not easy. So I think my personal feeling is that we need to sit and talk with them. It's a diplomatic engagement that is required. I've always been saying that too much of military diplomacy has been taking place. We need to take it to a higher level.
But what more can we do? The Prime Minister has met Xi Jinping 15 times. He has been to China 5 times. He has been to Wuhan and Mamallapuram. And what more diplomacy can you have? In fact, does it give it an impression of friendliness which does not seem to be there?
I agree that that is a problem, but I think this is the best option that we have currently. I do not think the military option is available. Despite Rafale aircraft coming in, we still are not in the same league as China. The economic option, there is not that much of. We need to sit and find out what is in their mind. And perhaps I think, I really feel that it is important for India to settle its borders. Now you have border problems with Pakistan, with border problems with China. A new one has started with Nepal. Tomorrow Sri Lanka may say that Tamil Nadu is part of Sri Lanka. We don't know.
No, but border, we are to settle. We are like Marcus is always willing.
I think we should. I think we should. I mean, they are also saying we want to settle. So we need to sit down with them and settle.
But there is no time-bound. There is no time-bound discussion. So the Chinese think that is a very long-term process. While for us, it is immediate because unless we settle that, this will continue this kind of.
I agree with you. I agree that we have to settle and we have to take the initiative and see what can be done. Because China, as you said, with its present position, it can just sort of sit back and wait for things to develop.
No, but is there an option like learning something from Pakistan? Pakistan has said there is a core issue which is Kashmir. So still that is resolved. We are not going to have any activity with India. No trade. We are willing to talk, but no trade. So many restrictions. And so till the core issue is resolved, we are not going to do with anything with India. Can we say a similar thing to the Chinese, that unless this core issue is resolved, we will have nothing to do with you? Is that an option?
I don't think we have that much of room with China. I think both economically, commercially, militarily, in terms of GDP, we need to talk to China, find out what is the problem. Because as you mentioned, the Prime Minister had met these so many times. So probably they have an equation. I don't know at that level what is happening. So maybe you need to raise it to a higher level and see what will do. Maybe they are willing to settle.
Yeah, but this was most unexpected at the height of the pandemic, when the Chinese themselves are in the dock as to whether they created it or at least they hid it from the world. So they should be on the defensive at this moment in time. And therefore, it came as even a bigger surprise to us. Is there any reason they did it?
I think it is because they were on the defensive. That could also be one reason.
The offensive became the
See, offense becomes a form of defense. You divert people. That is how it happened. Even in 1962, the crisis that occurred, it is attributed to difficulties inside China, which resulted in their coming into India. After all, this forward policy which we have been following vis-a-vis China and the borders, that has been in operation throughout the 50s. You know, Indian soldiers used to go up to the border, then they will leave a cigarette packet or something there to show that they're in charge, then they'll come back. The Chinese will come to whatever is their conception of the border, they will also leave a cigarette packet, they'll go back. So that kind of a resolution was taking place. Suddenly we found that the Chinese came in and settled down. That is when, again, the whole concept in 62 was, the whole thinking was that if we become aggressive, China will not fight. That is a mistake that happened. So whenever there is an internal problem in China, or if you there is even an external problem because the relations with the US have deteriorated terribly, and there is a feeling that the India-US relationship is building up strongly. Now, this is the kind of atmosphere in which the Chinese will want to assert themselves. This has been our history. If you look at the past also, that is how it happens.
But the Chinese to complain that India is going thousands of miles to make friends with the United States while we are here, we are close neighbors. And why do you do that? At the same time, now they seem to be pushing us into the arms of the Americans.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there has been some kind of a cross communication, a lack of communication between the two countries, which I don't think at present is that serious. There is also a feeling, perhaps, because they are very closely aligned to Pakistan. And now, if you look at it, they are closely aligned to Nepal. They are closely aligned to Sri Lanka. And from Afghanistan, US is leaving. They are going away. So the whole area is unsettled for India right now. So here, I think very clever and a very smart diplomacy is required to see how we can wrest back the advantage we had till a few months ago.
Well, now we have a three-pronged approach. One is, of course, dialogue. Second is building up our arms. Third is the economic. How about the WTO? Where does WTO come into this? It comes only if we impose any sanctions, or how does it work?
No, the WTO has been rendered completely ineffective by the United States.
Yeah, people say it is dead. Do you agree with that?
What is that?
No, people say it is dead. WTO is gone.
It is dead. Actually, the present Director General has resigned.
Yeah.
Azevedo, Robert Azevedo has resigned. He said that somebody else take over. The fact is, you see, the strength of the WTO lies in its dispute settlement system. Its dispute settlement system is such that it can create damage to particular countries who violate the GATT norms. Now, the dispute settlement system is no longer functioning because the US, it's supposed to have an appellate body. There is a vacancy which arose in the appellate body which the US is refusing to fill. They are saying that nobody can come in there, let the appellate body system go. With the result that the dispute settlement system is gone. Once that goes, it is over. Similarly, the Doha round, which was started in 2003, I think, 2003, Everybody was saying we'll finish it in 3 years and so on at that point of time. Murasoli Maran was there at Doha. But that just collapsed. That totally collapsed.
Well, as ambassador to WTO, what was your experience? Were we not on a confrontation line with the developed countries?
Yes, we were on a very strong confrontation line. Huh? No, I personally believe, you see, there were some issues on which they were extremely aggressive, like introducing investment into the WTO. I mean, we said this is basically for trade. You can't bring in other issues. Investment, competition policy, government procurement, trade facilitation, they wanted to bring that inside. And we were opposing very strongly. Personally, I feel today, perhaps we would have gained a little had we not opposed. Particularly on investment, I think it would benefit us if we had an investment policy in the WTO. But at that time, the position taken by government was that we will not allow new issues to come into WTO. So we fought that very hard and we got it out of the WTO agenda and we can keep it.
But their insistence was on intellectual property rights. That was their primary concern.
Intellectual property rights actually had been settled in the Uruguay round. That is in 1996. Later on, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you. No, I don't hear. No, I don't hear. No. Some internet issue. Go to the bathroom.
Take off the
voice of the people on the
Are you back now?
Yes, you're all right. Now I can hear
you. Something went off. So what were we saying?
No, you have to adjust your face a little more. We have come up a little.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. What were we saying?
We are talking about WTO and the
idea. You were talking about TRIPS.
Yes.
Isn't it? Now, TRIPS is something which we had negotiated in 1996 only during the Uruguay round. Subsequently, there was another issue which I negotiated actually. That is, it's called the TRIPS and Public Health Agreement.
Right.
That is primarily because the African countries wanted to buy AIDS drugs very cheap from India. They had to pay much more from the US and other places. So they raised the issue. And this was immediately after I had taken charge. So I backed them fully. I practically worked from the Kenya ambassador's office. So finally, we came to a language which was acceptable to us. The United States alone opposed. So in one General Council meeting, they were totally isolated. The rest of the world wasn't. Then the whole issue went on. Finally, another language was reached, reasonably okay. And then again, it came to the General Council. And I knew that this was the only possibility. If we had not, this was just about 2 weeks before the Cancun Ministerial Conference. If we had not settled it at that point of time, what would have happened is that we had some key issues like agriculture. We had a defensive position in agriculture. The Singapore issue, there is investment, competition policy, etc. If this had gone to the ministerial conference in Cancun, it would have been settled there. But then the entire developing country bloc would have lost interest in the rest of the issues. So I thought it's better, and I calculated that it's better to settle it here itself in Geneva. And we had a reasonably good agreement, and I was sure the US is not going to go beyond that. So we settled it there. With the result that we were able to get our own position through in the Cancun Ministerial Conference also. It's a question of how you play your cards at a particular point of time. As you know very well, you're a very distinguished diplomat. The timing is very important. So,
but how do we, is there any expectation that WTO will come back to life and become as active as it was before?
It will depend to a great extent on the US election. Because if there is a change and the US gives up its America First policy and goes back to its traditional position of free trade, global free trade, then WTO will come back.
So it depends on the elections in November. Most things.
It will completely depend on that. If Trump comes back, then we can write off the WTO.
Like many other things. That's a rather unfortunate thing, but everybody is hoping against hope that some change would take.
No, you can't say. I mean, you can't say everybody is hoping against hope, because India also got a very close relationship with Trump. Right. Now the change there might affect us also.
Yeah, but you cannot depend on him, no? That is at the moment, I think maybe more because of Pompeo. There is a pro-Indian position developing, and he is not yet pleaded against it. But you cannot depend on Trump. He can, very emotionally, he can say something. And he has said several things.
You're right.
You cannot depend.
And also, you can't depend. You see, tomorrow suddenly he can change his stance also, like he did with North Korea. Yeah. I mean, he was so friendly with North Korea at one stage.
Even on China, he was much more friendly. Now China is the biggest deal as far as he is concerned. So all this uncertainty, at least.
So he's a quixotic fellow.
That's right.
So how he will jump, which way he will jump, nobody knows.
No, but there has to be some poetic justice. The way he has handled COVID, I don't think he has any moral right to continue his presidency.
But you see, one thing I've been noticing, I've been looking at these opinion polls for the US presidential election. Till about a few days ago, the difference between Biden and Trump was about 10%.
Right.
Today it has come down to around 7.5%.
Right. And it went up to 14%, yes.
It went up to 14% also, isn't it?
Yes, at one point.
I see. But anyway, I think that margin is shifting. So why it is shifting, I don't know.
Well, talking to Americans and Indians in America, one gets the feeling that the field is wide open.
Field is wide open.
Yes, nobody is there. Particularly the Indian community, strangely, have shifted considerably towards Trump's side. So that's only 1% of the voters. But still, that's the kind of people we talk to, because they all say that, we are supporting Trump. And of course, his core constituency, the so-called Bible Belt. There the support has only increased. It has not decreased at all. COVID does not seem to have made an impact, nor raised emissions.
Right.
Okay, coming
but again,
yes,
it will depend on the choice of the vice president candidate.
Right.
To some extent. Who Biden decides on will make a difference there also. It will lead to a shift in votes. So I still think it's a pretty open thing. with Biden having the edge now, but
does he take a minority person? Does he take a black? Does it make a lady? All kinds of things.
Yes, it will make a difference.
Yeah. Okay, coming back home, we are all discussing the new education policy. Because you have dealt with it, the planning commission, the planning board, we both work with it, etc.
Yeah.
But now what do you think? Do you think the criticism is somewhat subdued? Is it because this is generally acceptable? Of course, Kerala government has its own objections. But what do you think nationally? The change towards a more liberal, more job-oriented, a more westernized education, is it likely to be accepted generally?
Well, I am not very sure whether it is entirely a westernized model that has come out, because it is focusing on, say, regional languages up to a particular level.
No, I'm talking about the liberal part of it. And also the
liberal part of it has been there for a long time. Actually, also Kerala has not been liberal.
Also choice.
Kerala has not been. Huh?
Also choice-based.
Choice-based, yes.
Broad choice, bigger choices for the students, and also exit routes for various stages to go into professional. These are all very Western.
I think these are all good ideas. To what extent it can be implemented in India with the present education system, I am not sure.
Because how much is it implemented is the real test.
That is also there, yes.
But Kerala's position, as mentioned by the Vice Chairman of the Higher Education Council, he was objecting to the knowledge economy concept. How does it affect us? He says it will be manipulated by the corporate world. This is his main objective.
I think if you want jobs, you will have to bring in knowledge also. I think it is skill development is something which we started in Kerala. Actually, I remember K.M. Abraham came to my office one day, made a presentation on this ASAP program, as it's called.
Right.
That is how it started here, right? It's the same concept that is now being applied in a modified way in the national education policy also. So it's not something that is alien to us. Also, even when you talk of private participation, one story I keep saying all the time is that the first experiment in public-private partnership in education was started in Kerala.
Yes.
Right back in 1956.
Absolutely.
The schools, the infrastructure will be set up by somebody. The teachers will be paid by the government. That was started in Kerala only.
That was a major step in supporting private sector.
It was a huge step. It was a huge step. And that was not only a big step forward. If we were able to take advantage of the opportunities arising in the Gulf countries and abroad, it is because we had a literate population. We had people who could go and who knew, who could speak English, who could type, who had certain skills. So skill development, I think it's an integral part of education. And we should go for that.
No, so this exit points idea of a 4-year degree course, you can go out for 1 year or 2 years, your credit will be secured. I think that's a very good opportunity, because dropouts need not be dropouts forever. They can come back and make use of it.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, particularly in engineering, we have been noticing this. That people drop out and then that's it. They have to go to some other low skill occupation.
Or they become Steve Jobs or others. Dropouts or become millionaires. Yes.
Correct.
But this is an opportunity. But this knowledge and that idea that knowledge economy is not desirable, that's a little bit difficult to understand.
I also don't understand what is meant by a knowledge economy.
Well, he has explained that it means that knowledge is become a tradable good. As you know, in WTO there is a provision for that, and so you you sell and buy knowledge, information, etc. In terms of bringing in private sector.
That has been the traditional position of Kerala.
Right.
You have so many private universities all over the country. Many of our children go there outside to study.
Those who can afford go away anyway.
They go.
That's the
They
point.
go and study there.
But there are some
But
minor
somehow we have got. I don't agree with that position. I think we should allow private sector to come in if people want to study here. If they want your children to study here,
you know how much we tried.
should pay for that.
Personally,
Yes.
bring about that change. But you know what happened, and so we had to do.
I know. That's a mindset problem.
Also about foreign universities, again a mindset problem.
Yeah.
But I'm struck by the fact that the criticism is not too harsh or severe. And that's also because the government is taking the position that this is not final, we'll discuss more when we make the rules, we will consider the state position is a concurrent subject, etc. So they have also softened it, even though the cabinet has approved it. It is being presented in a soft manner. That may be also the reason why the criticism is not so hard.
Yes, I think right now the focus is on COVID and its containment. New education policy is there, but it will take time. There will have to be a lot of discussions with the state governments.
The focus is elsewhere.
Focus is elsewhere right now. And you have China on the other hand.
Yeah.
You have Pakistan eternally there. They've also claimed Junagadh now, in addition to all of Kashmir. They have, as you know.
How about the distractions in Kerala? For example, IAS, distractions in Kerala. To have a senior IAS officer being in the center of the controversy, how is it going to affect the morale of the bureaucracy?
Well, I think, an IAS officer, unfortunately, is an officer also I rated very highly because his achievements have been significant. When I was cabinet secretary in Delhi, he came one day, met me, and talked to me about the service centers, IT service centers. He had started in his district, Malappuram. So Malappuram provided the lead for the rest of the countries. After that, only the Akshaya Kendra concept came. This was easy. And then later on, of course, I dealt with him when he was chairman of the Electricity Board. I'm a little surprised and a little bit shocked by what has happened. And of course, I don't know anything about his personal life and so on. I don't take interest in the personal life of it.
No, but there is an impression that the rules are not being followed.
That impression is there. That impression is there.
No, that is what I meant about generally about bureaucracy in Kerala. Has it shocked them because you don't see much reaction from the others?
To be absolutely frank with you, I have not been in touch with the bureaucracy for a long time. I don't know really what is going on. But I think, in the long run, it is important for the bureaucracy to understand that there are shifting governmental systems, particularly in a state like Kerala. So, adherence to certain processes is safer for them. I mean, you can get very enthusiastic, get carried away, do a few things, which you would normally not do. But then a certain following a particular process is always best in a state like Kerala, not only in a state like Kerala, anywhere in the country. You cannot expect continuance of a way of thinking or of a particular support base. That's very important in my view.
No, but a single officer has been able to do things on his own so much. And now there are some other names are also being mentioned, people who take decisions on their own. And that is is that a deliberate part of the government, or this is just an accident, it's a stray case? Or is there some kind of liberalization of the bureaucracy? How do you interpret that?
Well, again, as I told you, I'm not very familiar with what is going on today.
Yes.
But if they are being really, if they are taking decisions on their own in different places, as I told you, it's important for them to be careful, because this is not a system that will remain forever. It's not a system that will remain forever. It is going to change. So that kind of, they should be always conscious that a particular line of thinking may not continue for a very long time. So they've got to prepare themselves accordingly.
People keep saying that this gold smuggling case has wider implications. It can upset the national economy, and it can have terrorist implications. Okay, terrorist implication is a separate issue that can be found. But how do you think that, 20 crores worth of gold or 30 crores worth of gold, will it make a big difference to Indian economy?
Well, actually, this is a question I was asked in the IAS interview in 1970 also. How is smuggling going to affect? How will it affect the economy? At that time, I didn't know the answer, and I told him also that I don't know.
No, so I have a sense that it is being exaggerated. Maybe.
You see, any kind of smuggling, you have to pay for what is smuggled into the country.
No, but the gold price is more or less the same everywhere. It's only a small element of tax which makes it attractive.
Well, if the gold element is the same, the price element is the same everywhere, then why should it be smuggled at all into the country?
Because of taxation. You reduce the tax.
Because of the taxation. Yeah. Because of the taxation. Absolutely right. So, actually, if you recall, in the 70s and 80s, we had these Haji Mastans and Dawood Ibrahims and so on. They used to be big at smuggling. That is because our tariffs used to be extraordinarily high. Very high it used to be. And smuggling was a wonderful occupation. You bring money here, then you do some cheating there, you take money out through Hawala, and the economy got damaged. The whole thing changed after 91. When we started liberalizing, when we started opening our economy. Now, gold, I don't know what is, perhaps the duty rate is too high. I don't know what is the duty rate for gold. Gold is a high value item. So even a small duty on that can mean a substantial amount.
And the price
also
hit the ceiling. Absolutely hit the ceiling. The price.
It can hit the ceiling. And there have been very ingenious ways of smuggling gold, which is very evident. I mean, there are many. Once I was traveling with
unthinkable techniques are used.
Unthinkable techniques. And there are some factories, I believe, here which have been set up only for reconditioning and removing this gold, extracting the gold. Yeah. There are workshops. So it can come as a liquid, it can come as powder, it can come in medicines, it can come as part of some equipment or some furniture.
Or the human body itself.
In the human body, it can come. So how to extract it? There's an entirely new small-scale industry which is developed here.
But the new angle here is the involvement of a diplomatic mission. That's another story, of course.
That is another story, and whether this is the first time or there are other missions all over the country involved, we don't know.
Right.
It could be a technique.
Okay, KMC, coming to the end of our conversation. Have you ever dealt with the Padmanabha Swami temple issue? And what is your take on this? Do you think this verdict is just and it will resolve this problem altogether? It may have.
No, I must say I have not dealt with that issue at all. I mean, I've just been reading about it. The gold, the ornaments that are deposited there. I don't know enough about the case. So I really don't.
No, but there is the other problem of other temples also, because the general assessment of this is that this is game changing, because other temples inside India were not administered by the government or the boards, etc., will undergo a change, whatever may happen here. So that is why I asked you this, whether there is any kind of
I don't know whether, in the other temples, governmental involvement is that great. Tirupati Trust is already there. Yes, I mean, I don't think there is any claimant for Tirupati. Likewise, the next richest is probably the Shirdi Trust. And Shirdi, again, I think there is a government involvement there, but there isn't a claimant who says, here the Maharaja is a claimant. That is how the whole case arose. I don't know whether there are too many claimants for temples and other big temples. Shabarimala, is there a claimant? I mean, maybe the king there can also claim. But I think it's already an established system. Might not be.
Well, this again, like any other decision, the implementation is going to matter. And then do you have any ideas how to deal with this pressure?
Which pressure?
The pressure in the temple. Of course, it will now go to the management. But there are
pressure.
Exhibit it, sell it, bonds to be raised by the Reserve Bank of India on that goal. You haven't thought of any such ideas?
No, I don't think the gold really now, particularly since it has gone back to the control of the Maharaja. The best thing that can happen is, as I see, that you have a big museum or an exhibition where these things are displayed. That would have touristic value over a certain period of time. Certainly, just leaving it in those chambers under the temple, that will be unfortunate because it just remains there. Nobody sees it. It's of no value to anybody. That I
don't know whether you have come up with this one proposal, which I found it rather interesting and maybe beneficial, is for the Reserve Bank to issue bonds on the basis of the gold being in the temple. Not to move that, but on the basis of that value, they raise bonds and raise money and use it for development purposes. And this remains as kind of a guarantee which hopefully will never have to be used. There is such an idea which is floating. I don't know whether.
But what is the advantage of that? If the Reserve Bank of India wants to raise bonds for government expenditure, they can do it anyway.
No, but on the basis of this gold that they have, it will be pledged to the Reserve Bank of India.
No, as it is, the point is, even without the gold, they can still issue bonds. That is deficit financing. It can be done. So they don't need any guarantee for that.
This will not
need any guarantee.
No, more the Reserve Bank of India will be more comfortable with it because they have this gold in an emergency.
No, if you want to, coming to your point, agreeing with your point, if they issue bonds, suppose the whole idea of the bond is that it has backup security. Can they claim the security in case the bond fails? So that may not be necessary. I don't think the Reserve Bank of India raising bonds is such a big issue. They have got huge foreign exchange reserves. They've got plenty of gold. So Reserve Bank of India is a strong entity. I don't think that needs.
Let's conclude with a question about your book. When do we expect it and what is it going to be in it? Let's have a brief.
I think I'm working now. COVID has really helped me, because I'm staying at home. I'm writing 1,500 words a day. So it should be through quickly.
But you are not.
Even though, I've also thought of a title. The book I promised not to write. You see, throughout when I was cabinet secretary, a lot of people used to ask me, you must write your memoirs, you must write your story. I said, no, too many people have written about their own story. I won't write. Now, today, because I have time.
Interestingly, even after you have written, they don't read the book and they still ask you to write.
Yes,
To tell me,
right.
why don't you write?
Absolutely. You're
When they
right.
tell me, why don't you write all this? I said, it's already written. I have 6 books. But
I think you have 9 books, no?
sorry.
I think you have 9 books now, no?
Yeah, well, 2 are co-author. 7
Okay.
my own.
Okay.
So I'm writing one more in order to satisfy curiosity.
On what?
It's some kind of personalized what shall we say, experiential diplomacy kind of thing.
Okay.
Solution
Yeah, that will be very
over
very
each of the
interesting.
postings I did. The earlier one was more anecdotal, more impressionistic. Now the idea is to say, for example, you go to a station and then you see the evolution of our policy towards that station. By the time I left, what exactly happened?
That is a very good thing.
Yeah, that is a good idea. That's what I want.
One would look forward to reading it.
Very much. Same here. I think your book would be very much attractive to everybody.
Hope so.
The aspirants to the IAS. Well,
It's become too long, you know. How many words go into a page?
Sorry?
Printed page. How many words go into a printed page?
Well, about, I don't know, I have not calculated. It's about 200, 300, right?
200 to 300, around 250.
No, your formula is right. If you write 1500 words a day, which is a normal op-ed page article kind of thing, then you can completely quickly finish it. You will probably have 80,000 words, right? Or 100,000.
Yeah. Well, I already have around 70,000 words. So
that is a
reaching the end.
That's a reasonable size. If it is too much, also you write the book on Krishna Menon. You can't even carry in your hand. So it is or the Ivory Throne. These are the books I'd like to read, but unfortunately, you can't even carry it on a flight or do something about it. Well, thank you very much, guys. It was very good.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you as usual.
Very good. I'm sure.
I hope we can meet personally.
Yes, one of these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you.